Hello there, my name's Richard Pigott. I'm a director at Planning and Design Practice, and welcome to this short webinar providing an overview of Class Q permitted development rights. So today we're going to cover three main topics. We'll start by running through the basics of Class Q. So what are the main elements of the legislation? What does it allow in terms of converting agricultural buildings to dwellings? We'll then run through three key things to be aware of, which have come out of key appeal decisions and court cases since the Class Q legislation was introduced in 2014. So what does Class Q allow? As I've just said, it was introduced in April 2014 and it was very contentious at the time. And I think, to be honest, a lot of people didn't really expect it to happen until it actually did. You know, there'd been talk of it happening for a year or two, but yeah, nobody quite believed that it would be introduced until it did happen. So in simple terms, it allows the change of use of a building and any land within its curtilage from an agricultural use to a C3 dwelling house. And then secondly, it allows building operations reasonably necessary to convert the building to a use falling within Class C3. Initially then, when it was introduced in 2014, there was quite a lot of head scratching and confusion about how it would be implemented and what it would actually mean. And I think it's fair to say that there was a lot of there was a lot of resistance to it from local planning authorities and planning officers who really didn't like the idea of often modern and not typical barn conversions being able to be converted to houses. So there was, given this resistance, local authorities were refusing applications whenever they could, particularly due to the locational sustainability test. So in other words, local authorities were using the argument that such buildings were not in a sustainable location and therefore they should be refused as an unsustainable form of development. However, there was certainly a lack of guidance to accompany the legislation, and to compound matters, the legislation was pretty ambiguous. So there was a lot of confusion and a lot of different interpretations of how it should be implemented, and this was probably best reflected in the fact that in the first year or two, only 21% of appeals were allowed, and many of those were refused on the basis that the buildings were located in unsustainable locations. There are a number of limitations that come with the Class Q permitted development right. One key one, of course, being that the building must be in sole agricultural use and part of a registered agricultural holding on the 20th of March 2013, or when last in use with no intervening uses. This is crucial. The building cannot be in equestrian use, for example, or it cannot be in any sort of domestic use. It has to be in agricultural use, or you need to be able to demonstrate that when it was last in use, it was in agricultural use. So that's one key stumbling block, if you like, which buildings will often fall down on. You can create up to 5 dwellings on each agricultural holding, with a combination of larger dwellings, which are those over 100 square meters, and smaller dwellings, which are under 100 square meters. You cannot extend beyond the existing envelope of the building, so therefore, you cannot extend either the footprint of the building or any part of the walls or roof of the building. And the building must be strong enough to take the loading caused by the external alterations that are proposed as part of the conversion. A few further limitations. There's a 3-year time limit to complete the building works, which of course is different to the normal time limit on a planning consent where it is 3 years to commence development. The permitted residential curtilage is small, therefore anything larger than the footprint of the building requires planning permission. But there is a stipulation on internal works. The planning practice guidance, which fleshes out the Class Q legislation, does state that internal works are not generally development. And it goes on to state that a number of building operations, if you like, are permissible, such as undertaking internal structural works, including to allow for a floor, the insertion of a mezzanine or upper floors within the overall residential floor space permitted, or internal walls. So they are all allowed within the scope of Class Q. Further limitations, you cannot use Class Q if other works were carried out using your Part 6 agricultural permitted development rights since 2013. The Class Q rights do not apply to listed buildings or buildings within conservation areas, areas of outstanding natural beauty, World Heritage Sites, or in national parks. Another limitation is that any new agricultural buildings constructed with planning permission cannot be converted into dwellings under Class Q for at least 10 years. And a dwelling created under Class Q has no permitted development rights to alter or extend it. So in other words, any further alterations you would like to make to that dwelling would be subject to a further planning application. There is a prior approval notification process which you have to go through, and that involves essentially making an application to your local authority, and they will assess a number of factors to make sure that they are happy that there wouldn't be any significant adverse impacts as a result of converting the building to a dwelling. And these include transport and highways impacts, noise impacts, contamination, flooding, whether the location or siting of the building makes it otherwise impractical or undesirable to be converted, and subcategory F is the design or external appearance of the building. So sustainability of location, just to touch on that a bit further. It has been clarified that the permitted development right does not apply a test in relation to sustainability of location. Instead, the local planning authority can consider whether the location and siting of the building would make it impractical or undesirable to change use to a house. And what this means really is that if a building is located, for example, at the top of a hill or a long way from the nearest road or services, then that might be a reason to refuse an application. But as I said before, there's no right to refuse something just because it is located remotely from the nearest town or village. So 3 key issues which have emerged, if you like, over the last 5 or 6 years since the permitted development right was introduced. One is that it must be deemed to be a conversion and not a rebuild. Another is that pre-application internal works to the building are possible. And thirdly, Class Q can provide a very useful fallback position. So I'll just talk through each of those in a bit more detail. So firstly, it must be a conversion and not a rebuild. This issue, if you like, it really came to the fore in November 2016 when a High Court decision was issued, which really clarified that what you are doing to a building must be deemed and reasonably be deemed to be a conversion, and not essentially a new building constructed within or around an existing barn. And the case that's referred to there, the Pigott case, involved a 30-metre steel frame barn which was largely open on 3 sides. The local planning authority refused the conversion. The applicants went to appeal, but the planning inspector subsequently dismissed the appeal. Mr. and Mrs. Pigott, not willing to accept this decision, sought to quash the inspector's decision and took it all the way to the High Court. But unfortunately, they were unsuccessful with that, unfortunately for them. And this decision essentially blew a lot of previous case law and appeal decisions out of the water, and it introduced this new threshold and this new test that essentially a building must be capable of conversion and capable of functioning as a dwelling prior to the application being made. And this really introduced a test, really, in terms of what might be deemed to be a conversion. So yeah, this distinction, if you like, between what's a conversion and what is a rebuild or a fresh build, it is a very grey area. It's not a matter of there's no clear line in the sand between what's a conversion and what's a fresh build. It is very much a matter of planning judgment. But what we do know is that much of the existing external fabric of the building must now be retained. And as a general rule of thumb, the building must be enclosed on at least 3 sides to now be deemed to be capable of being converted to a dwelling under Class Q. Another interesting point to note is that pre-application internal works to the building are possible. And this relates to Section 55 of the Town and Country Planning Act 1990, which states that the following operations or uses of land shall not be taken for the purposes of this Act to involve development of the land. And what it states is that the carrying out for the maintenance, improvement or other alteration of any building of works which affect only the interior of the building or do not materially affect the external appearance of the building. So those elements highlighted in red are not taken to amount to development under the terms of the Act, and therefore planning permission is not required for those works. And as we've stated at the bottom there, this is now explicit in Planning Practice Guidance, paragraph 105. So pre-application internal works to the building are possible, as we've just stated. And we have some direct experience of this, having handled a case on a Class Q appeal in the Staffordshire Moorlands. And essentially, we got a structural engineer to come and look at the building and carry out a structural assessment of the building. And they advised that the existing steels were not sufficiently strong to support the external loading that would be required to convert the building to a dwelling. And there you can just see a couple of pictures of the building as it stood, when we first went and had a look at it. And what you can see in this picture is the blue steel supports. They were added prior to making the application, and these were done with full disclosure to the local authority. There was no hiding the fact that these had been done, and we brought these to the to the attention of the planning authority at the application stage, and argued that because they were internal works, they were perfectly permissible and they didn't require planning permission. The council weren't overly happy with this, and they refused the application. We went to appeal, and the appeal inspector agreed that they were not development and accepted them as part of the building to be converted. And we subsequently won that appeal, and Class Q consent was granted, and I think that building is now very close to completion. The final point to note is that Class Q, a Class Q consent can be used as a very useful fallback position. So one example we are aware of is where the conversion of a large barn to 3 dwellings and the replacement of an existing bungalow was permitted under Class Q, or a combination of Class Q and a planning application. A planning application was then submitted to demolish the barn and bungalows and erect 4 detached dwellings, and this was approved by the council, but was challenged by an aggrieved third party who felt that the council had given too much weight to the theoretical fallback position. So this ended up at the Court of Appeal, and the judge deciding this case confirmed that the fallback position was a clear material planning consideration, and that provided the council had given clear and cogent reasoning for giving that fallback position significant weight, then they had not erred in law in doing that. And interestingly, some local planning authorities now actively encourage developers to consider an alternative new build scheme. And for example, the current guidance note on Class Q published by Cornwall Council says that in certain circumstances an application for an alternative form of development may well be preferable to the original Class Q consent, and may result in a better scheme in terms of design and amenity provision. Just to go back, this is to illustrate that point, if you like. On the left, you've got a Class Q consent, and essentially you would be comparing something such as that, and you'd be going to the local authority and saying that we think that a scheme which perhaps uses more traditional materials, has a more traditional form, built in more agricultural vernacular and language, if you like, would be preferable and more conducive to the character and appearance of the area than simply converting a shallow pitched modern agricultural building, which perhaps isn't as easy on the eye. So that just gives you an example of how you would be comparing a Class Q consent and a proposed scheme under a full planning application. Finally, just to touch on some additional planning applications which you might submit following the grant of a Class Q planning consent. It's sometimes desirable to follow a Class Q consent with full application in order to, for example, improve the external appearance of the building, to give it recladding, new walls or new roof. And following the decision in the Pigott case, this would now need planning permission rather than something which you could do as part of a Class Q application. Another additional consent you might want to seek following the grant of Class Q would be to extend the residential curtilage, which under Class Q can only be as large as the footprint of the building. So in many cases that is a very restrictive residential curtilage, when you consider that you have to include any any parking space and garden space, if that area is limited to the footprint of the building, then it's pretty small really. So that might be another reason to go back with a further application to extend it slightly. And it would have to be a fairly modest extension, and probably to follow some existing line or feature on the ground, such as an existing wall, fence or hedge. If there's a logical line to extend it out to, then that is probably something which would have a fair chance of success with a subsequent planning application. And then finally there, obviously what Class Q doesn't allow is for any additional garages or outbuildings. So it's not unreasonable for such rural buildings to have external outbuildings like that. And we have found that councils on the whole are willing to accept reasonable changes and additions to buildings, again subject to the consideration of scale and impact on character and appearance, and any other common planning issues such as impact on neighbours or impact on highway safety. So there you have it. That was just a quick run through some of the key issues that we found in dealing with a large number of Class Q applications over the last 5 or 6 years. If you go to our website, there's plenty more information there about some of the projects that we've worked on. We've provided a fair degree of commentary about the changes to the Class Q legislation over the years. As ever, feel free to get in touch. We're happy to speak to people and get to know you and your project and see how we can help. So yeah, don't hesitate to pick up the phone or drop us a line, and we'd be happy to look at your project and see what we can do to help. Thank you very much.